Hello, welcome to Encounters. My guest today is Jim Lescault, the Executive Director of ACTV, the station from which we are currently working. Jim may not like the word station any longer because I understand that ACTV is moving in a more futuristic direction, calling itself an Information Communication and Technology Center, and I'm sure that he will explain what this is all about in a minute. But let me start probably a bit in the past. The two of us arrived here in Amherst about the same time. You were
That's
first, October 2007, I a few months later. And although you come from nearby, Holyoke, I'm from a bit further away, we have over the few years we know each other, learned that we have a common past, and we share a couple of things. And I've learned also over the past 2 years that you have really energized this station. How come? What brought you here, and what do you think you can contribute to this community?
Well, Jan, thanks for having me on your show. I appreciate it. There's so much that question is loaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I think that my own background really moved me to understand the importance of access and for people, both for training purposes, for distribution of material, and for exposure to some of the new technologies way before a lot of people might have their hands on that, especially from low-income communities or elderly communities that don't stay up like our college students do with the new technologies. So, I mean, this had opened up at ACTV right at a time when I was finishing in Holyoke. I helped develop a federal program called Evening Start, which is a family literacy program for 6 years for the school department, and it got defunded for the war effort by the Bush administration.
Oh, really?
So that brought me into being interviewed here at ACTV.
But before, you were basically involved in more what we could call the traditional community development projects, right?
Yeah, I would say we used to be proud to call it community organizing, actually. And that recently came up in the Obama campaign as a negative, which turned out to be a positive. I guess if I was to say what really visually, why I got drawn to visual media, I'd have to say growing up with a severe speech impediment, where I was with others in the elementary school brought together and using art to express our feelings and a way of feeling good about ourselves.
Right.
So that stayed with me for a long period of time. And the visuals of Life magazine, Look magazine, very large formats. You're talking, I was born in '53, so there were still images being released of World War II. And then, of course, the Korean War. And so there was a lot of very photojournalism, very provocative, black and white, that really impressed me and moved me. So how to interpret stills and what did stories, how did they convey stories and feelings, moved me. And also the period of time of growing up and watching your president being assassinated on TV and replayed and replayed. I actually was home ill at the time where I saw Ruby shot live on TV. That, along with Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, getting as much coverage as they did. So it was a very different time. I mean, as television was growing and as social upheaval and challenges were happening within this country and elsewhere, we were seeing it in our living rooms, you know.
Yes.
And so not only was it the television of TV shows, but also the documentaries of Frederick Wiseman and the CBS white papers looking at institutions of the United States. So that was forming me, who I was. And many years later, I didn't go on to college traditionally right after high school, and I found myself in the factory in the inner city of Holyoke, where I was born and raised, and a factory where my father had worked. And I was driving through a neighborhood that I really didn't know every morning. And a friend of mine had a camera, 8mm camera, and was doing a project, MFA project at UMass, and we traded. He said, would you help me shoot something? I'll let you borrow the camera. And I went around on my time off and just started shooting the city and on 8mm film, and then teaching myself how to edit it with a little guillotine, editor, and put together a program called Pigeon Man's Revenge and showed it to friends and family. And it really hit me how the images were of confinement and people being controlled within an environment.
Why the title, if I may ask?
Pigeon Man's Revenge was that one of the key people I stumbled across was a man that let pigeons land all over him in the Central Park, Hamden Park. It's in the central part of the city. And he let me film him, and constantly the pigeons were coming to him for feeding. And he just was symbolic to me, I think, and played that role within the film.
So recurrent image.
Yeah, recurring image. But from that, because my friend went on to start a video company in East Long Meadow, he invited me to join him, and I got on job training. We were doing industrials, commercials, and so I was learning how to do 3/4-inch editing. I got tired of that. It took about a year and a half, 2 years, where I said, okay, I don't need to do any more industrials. And I connected with a group called the Office for Children in Holyoke. And I offered to teach video to youth as a volunteer. And that's what connected me back to my own community,
right,
in a way of doing something that I thought I could contribute. And those young people went on to do a show, this is 1977, with Porta-Packs, reel-to-reel Porta-Packs. A show they called Holyoke a Teenage Limbo. And they looked at the lack of services. And from that, they organized themselves and started working with the city and demanding assistance and getting, they used to lock up, for instance, in the inner city, the basketball courts in the summer. So they created leagues at night and got lights turned on in bleachers. And so it was really a chance for me to see young people get more actively involved and be listened to. So it was a real impetus for change at that point.
On a previous occasion, we had Tim Kennedy here, and he explained how he got involved in all these projects in Lescault. One of the major aspects of his approach was to respect people and to give them a voice, or provide an opportunity for them to voice their own concerns and expectations. How did it work out in your case?
Well, I did enjoy meeting Tim and also his movies, and I think it was really very insightful. It brought back a lot of memories talking with Tim. We had a real problem in Holyoke because the only place you could get equipment was the furthest from downtown as you could get. You were actually on the border of Westfield, the furthest away. Yeah. There was no buses. We didn't have cars. So that became a real problem for us. And we showed it around as much as you could, but you understand that the 3/4-inch machines were very heavy, televisions were much bigger, so it was not an easy issue. What I got more involved with was the organizing with individuals, because that was, as I said, the youth took it upon themselves to start getting more actively. But Holyoke was in the huge transition of a lot of Puerto Rican families moving in. There was no translations going on. There was a lot of issues happening. And I became more and more involved with community organizing. And we wanted to use the video, but it was just that difficult and time-consuming to try to find it. And I really regret that we weren't able to figure out a way to record as much as we did. But part of the process was to bring people out through creating our own media, through newspapers, bilingual newspapers, by flyers, by holding general meetings where people would get a chance to talk and identify themselves as potential leaders. And we started building organizations within the city of resident citizens speaking on the behalf. For instance, there used to be about $10 million a year coming in community development block grant for poor people. But it was being used in ways that we felt and the residents weren't meeting the needs of that community. They needed larger family units and whatnot. So we would organize community participation at their public hearings of 300 people. And then they didn't even have translation, so we would provide translation. And that helped mobilize a lot of people around education, around housing. Arson was huge at the time, so I became very involved with arson prevention, how to do research. It was very educational for me, and the media part of the visual media got kind of put to the side. But I will say the media of how to take newsprint and manipulate it to get your viewpoint in as often as possible, and getting photographs and documenting as much as you could. We were very successful at that. And you know, I felt good by the time I left. I was there for about 3 years, and we had 2 federal lawsuits, bilingual desegregation of the school system that I was involved with. I wasn't alone, obviously, and also a federal housing lawsuit, and we won both for a poor community to win those two at the same simultaneously is just unheard of, and it took a lot of effort.
What triggered the success, you think?
I think the timing, you know, you have to understand the federal government at that time, there was more protection in place, even within housing and urban development had gone through. Gino Peroni and other different individuals had really brought participation in and took it seriously. There was a Civil Rights Commission and department within the federal and state level that really were there to hear these complaints and take it in a serious way. So I think we've lost a lot of that as a country, but that time, and they had abused it for so long, the empirical data was just against them, you know. So, but I left the city around '81 to go pursue my education down at UMass Boston.
Yeah, and what I understand by now is that you started off always with some kind of media around you, either in a passive way, consuming photographs and watching everything which was happening through the lens of the TV camera. Gradually you moved into a direction of community organizing, you said, but media were still in the background rather than in the forefront. What has stimulated you to make the move, so to make a move as you currently did, to become more visible in the media and then use your, I guess, background and expertise to create that kind of link? What is the importance of media these days?
I think a couple things occurred. That when I was in Boston, I went to the College of Community and Public Service out of UMass, and it was very action-oriented, you know, where you brought in and got certification for a lot of work you'd already done, and we worked in the communities in Boston. I think, you know, that and I got involved with the urban educational systems, which was an anti-arson prevention group nationally. I was still frustrated with working with community groups nationally that weren't using media and weren't getting their hands on media enough. So as I went through that period, and it brought me across the country a lot, I'd always lecture or put into the training components of that. We used a film by Third Reel, World Reel, out of New York on the closing of a fire station in Williamsburg that the people took over, and it was called the People's Firehouse during Beam's administration. Rand had written saying if you close X amount of fire stations, well, the city was burning.
Right.
And you know, at the same time, they were going to expose a lot of low-income and middle-class communities to more higher risk of exploitation and you know, and fear. So we used that to show how a community organized, and they did a great job of capturing that. So it made me want to do more, and so after a few years of running that organization, I decided I wanted to get back into media. I actually approached Frederick Wiseman, and he wasn't taking interns on at the time. I said, all right, well, I'll go do it myself. A friend said, why don't you just go do it? So I came back to Holyoke.
Right.
And I offered to do, through the Girls Inc., a show on young women. But what I did is I wanted to let the young people, again, choose what the issue was. So I kind of knew what some of the major issues facing the city was, but I got a counselor who sat in and found a lot of women through different programs, young teens, and they did interviews. And from that, 80-some-odd% picked teen pregnancy as the #1 issue they were confronted by. So from that, out of the 30-some-odd young women we interviewed, we selected about 8 or 9 who I got PBS and the WGBY here in Springfield to let me put a show on. So I found a host, Magdalena Gomez, had just moved up from New York, and we had never met. Turned out to be someone I'm going to get involved with for a long period of time. And she did an amazing job. We hosted it. But and the young women were very forthcoming in their perceptions. Everything from 14 to 19 were represented in age on this talk show. But WGBY, in their wisdom, plays the show at 3 o'clock in the morning on July 4th.
Great timing.
Great timing. You know, first of all, we're trying to explain how we need to outreach into a community that's mainly non-English speaking, but those that are English speaking aren't watching your local show. So how can we get in there? And they bury it. So that left a lot of, you know.
Did they explain why they were so poor in scheduling?
No, they just traditionally, there's more money under underwriting. This met the requirements of doing local programming. So what, that's another whole show.
Right.
But, you know, what was interesting about that is that I used the show back, now the equipment of 1989 was a lot lighter. You had VCRs. People understood what VCR meant, video cassette recorders, and your cameras were smaller. You were able to bring in equipment and set up so we did storefront showings to the agencies that were working with teens and left that. So again, once again, showing how video could not only capture the young people viewpoint. Ken Burns had just come out with Civil War, and part of the little money I raised for this was going to the local art council and saying, Ken Burns, the reason it worked is it was real people's history, their memoirs, their letters home. Here you have the young people, you need to hear it now, what they're saying, and that really resonated with them. And
but the technology also facilitated the more do-it-yourself approach.
Exactly. I mean, when we did it in '76 with the teen limbo, video was not a word in the community. And putting a camera in someone's face that looked a little bit like a radar gun that the police use now was kind of frightening in the inner city for people, to be quite honest. So more and more people were using it at home and have been videotaped, so more, you could approach them in the street. They weren't as freaked out about talking. But that was that process, and from that, a lot of them said they recommended peer education. So from that, I said, okay, and I set up a second show where we brought in 21-year-olds that Magdalena had actually trained in Brooklyn on sexuality and AIDS prevention, came up and they ran a workshop for a week. We went through a local community-based group, and they trained the young women on sexual diseases, transmitted diseases, and HIV and AIDS. And they went out, we videotaped the whole process. Then they went out door knocking and explaining.
They themselves.
They themselves. And then we recorded them. They actually had a Halloween party where this was all used in games. And it was really quite interesting. Again, a tool, both for now that agency to get more funding, to reach out to more young people. And you had the VCRs set up where you could watch them in the homes. So that was a different distribution model, but we felt very good about the process, that it first show informed us what the second show should be by the young people, and they were involved in that and carrying on a regular process. But after that, I ended up leaving and going to New York at that point.
But it still sounds as if you were using media, VCR and video in that time as a tool for social change rather than as the mechanism to create or to mobilize social change.
Well, you always want to hope that you're going to get the full bang for this and what someone wants to do with it. I was a little disappointed at times where the young people got it more than the people running the agencies who would sometimes put it on a shelf, and I go like, for a couple dollars you can make a lot of copies. I mean, United Farm Workers had already done their major VCR tapes distributed across the country to try to get boycotts started, which was direct mail with VCRs, which was very unique and very interesting. And that had informed me like how this could be used. So I was constantly trying to use it in a way that would mobilize, but I also was a realist in knowing that social change doesn't happen overnight by any means.
Indeed, it needs to be sustained for a while. You also mentioned to me that you produced a documentary, bilingual documentary, Poder, Power, on Holyoke. Can you explain what happened then?
I'd been in New York for about 5 years, and I did a few programs for the city there and some unions, and it was just too hard. I mean, to make your nut in New York and cover your costs is really difficult. So I was on my way back to Boston. I stopped in Holyoke, and I picked up some work through friends that used to work with WGBY as producers through the museums in Springfield. And we did one of the first History Channel shows, actually. And what I found out is Holyoke at that time was starting to gear up for a question of owning and operating the Holyoke Dam. It was a 50-year license. And I mentioned to you earlier that I said, well, this is great. This is something exciting to grab onto and get involved with. And we found quickly that most people in the city always thought it was owned by the city because it was Holyoke Water Power. And it was it was a private firm that was run by Northeast Utilities, major energy producer. So one of my concepts was like, let's do a documentary based on Constance Green's 1930s work. She was one of the first sociologists at Smith College and married to an industrialist in Holyoke. So there's this wonderful book with all the data you could ever, empirical data of birth rates and where people worked and broken down by race and demographics and just who lived where. Amazing book, right? So I said, well, I'm going to dedicate it to her and use this as my Bible, if you will, for the context. And I followed, what I wanted to do is follow the early years of the building of the city as a planned industrial city with the Irish, and then the French being brought from Canada during its famine to operate the textile mills, and then later immigration group being the Latinos coming in the 50s, coming off of the tobacco migration, the farm work, and coming in and filling in still when there was enough of entry-level jobs. So I wanted to show it in that progression. How did housing, education, job opportunities went each of those cycles, if you will. So I broke it down into segments, about 25-minute segments. I think there was 5 segments. But I also, Magdalena was around. I asked her, would you do the stand-up for the Spanish? So we would, Spanish-speaking version, so we didn't dub. We shot everything twice with the same background, and it was quite intensive, to be honest with you. It was really a lot of work. We went from a very purely documentary format of stand-up and old photos and in front of the existing, to by the end, you were watching at home the 1950s, where the original challenge had happened, the last challenge, now the current, mayor kind of mirroring what had happened in the 50s. And then you were watching meetings that happened the week before. So we were becoming more, by the end, news turnaround time as a documentary format within a bigger story. Never took a position, but it was a referendum in front of the city. And that referendum ended up passing 78% in favor, which is still one of the highest ever referendums in Massachusetts. I think it was been matched once. That said, on top of the documentary, never took a position, but I was also involved with, we had the direct mailings, there was phone call banks, there was TV spots that I made, there was radio spots that I made, and it was a total media integration. And how do you sell economic development in the inner city ward, and what was the selling points in the upper wards, in the middle and upper class? So I mean, it really was the first time I got a chance to really play with a lot of different things, and was very successful. Did it sustain the changes we had hoped for? I don't think so. I don't think we've gotten the economic engine going there. I think they locally dropped the ball on a lot of what they could have done with that, but they did win the license. They did. That was telling them to go for it, and they did win it. So that was really an exciting time for me to come back and be involved with something that dramatic. Yeah.
Yeah, I do understand that if you have the opportunity to be involved in such kind of a multidimensional, multimedia kind of integrated approach, it is quite rewarding, and it also leads to hopefully more sustainable kind of impacts on the long term. But if I may put it in a bit of a cynical way, of course I'm not homegrown, and I've only been to Holyoke a couple of times, but to me it seems as if it's comparable to what Michael Moore always refers to as his hometown, Flint, Michigan. So is it really yes, that pessimistic as an outlook, or am I looking at the surface and can't really go underground and see what's really happening there?
I try to stay optimistic. I myself had a lot of frustration in the city of Holyoke. We had a lot of success. What I think is the most upsetting, yes, the Flint, weren't in automobile production, but almost were, but we weren't. But I think going back to the Power series, my own edification of what I was finding out was the demise. It was very early on that the city really had peaked by 1920. It was the #1 paper maker in the world at one time, from rags, starting in the 1880s but by 1920 it had peaked. 60,000 was the population. The industry, it was hydroelectric, and then hydropower. When it went to hydroelectric, then your electricity could be sent to you elsewhere, so you didn't need to be by the water source. So and then textiles started going closer to the south towards the cotton and the threads. So all of that became very understandable to me in a point in time where I was trying to revigorate the economy in a local fashion. And I think there is 2 things that work in a city like Holyoke. I think any place that's built purely on greed, purely on a capitalistic venture, right? It was planned industrial city.
Right.
They controlled the bridges. They controlled where your housing was going to be. And that's in this documentary. So there was a long battle of people being confined within a very small area, you know. When you look at that, and then you look at racism because of people being pitted against each other economically. The Irish in the paper making, the French in the textiles, and they would clash where they lived, the enclave living. So, I mean, that's embedded in the DNA of people that have been there. You now bring your last wave of people, and I don't call them immigrants because Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and people usually forget that. But as they come in, again, with language differences and culture differences, they must feel like they're dropped into the moon. Because, you know, what is this place? It looks like 1880s. No one explains to you what it was, what it is now. You're just living amongst it. So I really saw that need to, you know, to try to get their awareness. And a lot of people really appreciated the history of the Power series because it did that for them. It said, like, it expanded time backwards so they could understand why perhaps all this anger, you know, like, why are they being blamed for the demise of the city? They weren't here in 1920. There was the worst housing conditions in 1880. It's still the worst housing condition. They didn't make it the worst housing condition. So a lot of that was like, I would say certain people didn't like what I did because it did show the man behind the curtain. And it really was in a forceful way on my part to say, stop it, you can't hide behind your lies anymore. And I think that control, that fear of the people that are different, racism and power, that's the reason I called it Power wasn't just because of the dam, it was about economic, political, and I think that's still in existence, and it's unfortunate, even though the demographics have changed. The shift of power has changed in the number of people. They still haven't gained political power. And you only get political power usually through economic
That's
power.
Indeed a very important factor in this. Maybe move on to your current
So did
challenge.
I make the comparison of Flint and Holyoke well enough? Or
Yeah, I think that
know.
you give us a hint here. Let's move on to ACTV.
Sure.
As I already indicated, I'm quite impressed with what you've achieved in 2 years, a few months. Of course, I'm sure you'll say that this is not a one-man show. This can only be achieved with a team and with support mechanisms. But give our viewers a bit of a glimpse into the future. What would you like to achieve here? What would you like to create?
Okay. I appreciate that, Jan. It was a challenge coming in because Amherst Community Television had just signed on another 10-year contract, but they had been without a executive director for a couple years. They didn't have money coming in for capital improvement because the contract was at its 10th year on the old contract. So a lot of people did keep this place going, and I have to credit them that worked here during the worst of times.
Right.
But the challenge was to retool, and we're in the midst of it. We're almost there. We've brought the digital capacity way up, and both in our server, digital server, our video on demand server. We're almost Mac exclusive in here now. We weren't before. We've increased our editing suites now. There's 6 existing iMacs. There's going to be 6 more, hopefully by the end of January of this year, bringing up to 12 editing suites for people. So one of the signal and the quality, of just even the lighting and tables and chairs of comfort, there was a lot of need to do that. And so I could not have done it. There was a good internal team. The board was very much supportive right from the get-go. And we've now created some new positions that have really helped us expand in the technology with a media coordinator, with a new Drupal website that's being developed. Craig Sinclair's helping with that. James O'Connor is continuously working on the programming aspect. He's a program manager of expanding and pulling off of files off of the web, things that we feel are important for this community, working to upgrade our technology. We've added a new outreach worker, which is now letting people in communities that have not utilized the space the way we would like them to, Cambodian community.
Wendy, right?
Wendy Blumenthal, thank you. And Daryl Bishop, who's been in and out of this place for years and years, is a part-time who helped put the studio back together. He's helping fix equipment, give advice on where to go with equipment purchasing, because the technological changes. So where we're going, hopefully, is in the right direction. And I mean that all sincerely, because there's so many different routes right now one could take. We want to make sure we're not just seen as a television station. So thank you for pointing that out right at the beginning of the show. We do want to make sure that, from my experience in the past, is not only access to equipment for those that can't afford it, to also distribution, right? That you don't have to, if you YouTube nowadays, anyone can put up and post something, but who's going to watch it?
Right.
So we're really trying to reach out to the universities and the colleges in the area, to the high schools, the middle schools, and to organizations saying, let us help you in the distribution, in the making of. If it's going to be flip cameras, how can you get the best audio on flip camera? How can you get that compressed in a way that looks really good up on a YouTube or on our website? Maybe you'd want to have your postings here on our website, which our members will be able to do, embed their own videos. So we see ourselves as in the technological way. I mentioned the Cambodian community. Wendy had reached out to the health worker that is part-time Cambodian outreach worker for this town of Amherst, and they were doing a show on diabetes that was multi-state. The software they were using was very complicated for teleconferencing, and we passed it at UMass. They tried to work with it. It was too difficult for them. They couldn't ensure that it was going to work. So Craig Sinclair here worked on it. We hosted them here, 20 individuals in the community, Cambodian individuals, but it was 9 states. There was 23 sites that were connected, so both video and audio, that we were a part of. And so we felt very good to be able to offer the community here, who used to drive all the way down southern Connecticut to be able to participate, to do it in their own community and in their community access center. We were the only community access center being utilized during that 9 state. So I see that as kind of the roles this...
Yeah, and technologically speaking, that's a facility which we already have. We can continue providing that kind of service, that it's not only Amherst-based, but much wider than the locality we currently live in, right?
Yeah, I mean, when I took the job, I was interviewed, and I pointed that out. I said, look, cable used to be defined by its geographic area. You know, you string the lines within that franchise, as they're called, and that's what you negotiate for. But now with the web and us being able to post so much video on the web, we are working with organizations in Springfield. They don't have a good access station situation down in Springfield. We're helping with the politicians down there, moving them hopefully towards that. Since I live there, I'm a resident of Springfield. Holyoke has nothing. We just had, we've been backing a professor at UMass who's doing an after-school program at a middle school, Peck Middle School. They just came up and did a site visit here. They were interviewing each other, shooting the studio cameras, and in the control room. Loved it. Now we're going to hopefully set a meeting up with the mayor down there and talk about access centers with some of those youth and how could they get that going again. So I see it as, yes, it's a localism, it's regionalism, and it's national, international. Your show Encounters, I know, we have data counter, and we can see where people are coming in from different countries viewing, in part by your show. We know that you have a lot of international connections.
Thank you.
And that's a big plus for us. We want that. We want to be a training center. We want, if there's for instance, we're going to start reaching out to the UMass graduate students because they don't have access to equipment on campus. It's only undergrad. So the grad students who are going back in education to Afghanistan, Pakistan, and other countries throughout the world, can they get some more advice on on how to use equipment here, affordable equipment, and maybe we can help set them up, but also be an opportunity, a platform for them to come back through with projects and programs that are going on in those countries. I really see that as part of our role in the future. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah, just for the viewers, could you give a bit of a straightforward overview of the services you provide
here
and the kind of service they can make use of once they become a member, I would say. Yeah. Because after all, every institution, also this station, needs some financial backing.
Yeah, well, we're still, I think, one of the cheapest tickets in town. $10 for a yearly membership, and then minimal cost of being trained in the PD 150s, which is a very nice camera, or the 170s, to go out into the community with tripods and microphones. We ask for a program, And that program description, we're expecting a program at the end so that we can show that's the trade-off.
Right.
The other equipment we train on is, as I mentioned, the IMAX, the Final Cut Pro, and other aspects within that, the Studio, Pro Studio. And that will be now up to 12. We're going to be, the studio training, we've taught groups how to use it. There's a high school age group called Student News that runs a monthly, bi-monthly sometimes, newscasting out of here, out of the studio. We have specials. We'll do workshops on audio. We'll do, bring people in and talk about what is journalism, the new journalism. We had some students from UMass working with the high school students. It's unlimited. We're really looking for what's called a civic journalism, and that's why we're setting up an extra room for editing, and we're hoping to train people in the communities that aren't getting any news coming out of, creating their own news, both in a way of blogging and visual, both in stills and video. So that's just the beginning of this. As I said, I think we want to develop our teleconferencing capacity for people. We've had bands in here, we've had tango lessons, youth programs.
Auctions.
Auctions for the Rotary auctions raised $58,000 for the local community in 2 years that go out to nonprofits. So we feel very good. We're diversifying, and we're trying to get the word out to the greater community of what we have to offer. I've been working closely with businesses throughout the region, and it looks like we may land a show out of here that's really promoting the region, the economic development aspect of who's already here. So there's constantly a reaching out on our part to realize that we have this great resource. It's underutilized by some segments of the community. I think the word is, as you've told me, that the ACTV gets mentioned around the university a lot more than when you first started, and thanks to you and others in your departments and some of the other departments. So I mean, it's really growing to the point where we have a lot of software developers in the area that we're trying to work with that have approached us about trying out some of their software in a community-based way. So it's endless, and I do see us becoming connected throughout the knowledge corridor, that we're a part of, that goes all the way down to New Haven, in changing of exchanging of information and programming.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned a couple of target groups and audiences which are already making use of the facilities, and I think that the town hall meetings which are being broadcasted are definitely also very popular for the Amherst community. But what if there are would be your priority audiences or groups in the community which still need to be worked on and invited more intensively to make proper use of the facilities here? In
the local community of Amherst. As I mentioned, I think the Cambodian community, though, that was one example where we are working, Wendy's continuing that dialogue of trying to get some of the young people to come in and be part of that civic journalism. Latino community I've reached out to and have conversations, ongoing conversations about a regular Spanish-speaking program coming out of here. The different religious organizations that are in here, I know Wendy is talking to a few about coming in and talking about common misconceptions of those religions, possibility then of commonalities. So I see those are some of the beginning. But for this town, for me, as an outsider, I still see it as a town and gown issue, where especially the university is looked upon both in blessing and I don't know what a non-blessing is, but the fact that it's an economic engine for this media community, yet at the same time those kids drive them nuts. So you hear both and you kind of go, well, you have to accept. And so we're looking at ways of reaching out. I've talked to the police department about doing some police community relation kind of building through video and training. So I'm excited about that. And the youth, for sure, is another group that I think is not here yet. I'm working with them right now on a whole class of public service announcements in the middle school. There's going to be a competition of these classes. So, and the nonprofits, I haven't probably stressed that enough. Those without the money can't afford a website and a webmaster and what are they doing with their mailings and how are they tracking their clients and their funding source? I think we definitely want to help them and set up opportunities to train them in ways of the use of the new social networking tools in a way that's more progressive and possibly time-saving and cost-effective for them that I don't think they're necessarily using yet.
Right. So still a lot of work to be done here.
Yeah. It'll always, and staying with the technological changes, as soon as you say something or buy, you know, a hard drive camera, it's going to be something new. So that's the real challenge with financial limitations.
Right. But as this program is about social change in a way, so, and as you have already hinted at a number of things which are related to social change, by way of summarizing, where would you explain or position ACTV in that kind of larger framework of social change in this community and maybe even in this country?
Well, part of my social change evolution of myself is that relying on individuals to come forth, if trained with the technology, should be able to, and then given some ideas of how to use that, come up with their own programming way and creative way of addressing these issues, rather than being imposed by us downward. Okay, so that's the longer process, if you will, and sometimes the more painful process if you're looking for quick change. Where I see us is in that motivating, outreaching, come in and keep bringing the bar up and getting people ready. And if need be, holding conferences, holding training on issues, on specific issues of this community. We've held things on the, you know, war here as panel discussions, on healthcare here at ACTV. So some of those bigger issues as well, that's on a national front. But on the local, I really think that we have to work with young people and also people that have been here a long time, that aren't utilizing the space, that are very involved, whether it be the redistricting of the school system. Are all people excited about that? Or no, of course not. Are they all getting a chance the same way to express themselves? No. So I'm reaching out and letting people know, if you don't agree or need an opportunity, this is a place for you to come. This is the place where so we hope to become a hub in many, many ways, both on the internet way, but also on a local way, where a lot of these issues possibly can get at least expressed, and at least the ideas be heard, that it's not just slighted by hand because you're not part of the normal media coverage.
I think that's a nice way of ending the show today. ACTV hopes to become the hub and the platform for social change in the local but also national community. Thanks, Jim, and
thank you.
All the best to you and the team which is working with you.
Thank you, Jan.
Thanks for your interest.